Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be here with Dr. Madan Lal Goel, and we have a wonderful discussion coming up about the parliamentary system in India, looking at different political systems around the world, and asking the question of whether a presidential system is more suitable for India in the current age. My name is Aditi Banerjee with the Infinity Foundation. So I have been working with Sri Rajiv Malhotra for several years. We worked together on the book Invading the Sacred and several other projects. So I'm honored to be here and very much looking forward to this discussion. Also, on a personal note, Dr. Goel is a friend of mine. We crossed paths at many past Waves conferences and other places, and it's wonderful to be talking with him. So very happy to have this opportunity. And maybe I'll just start by asking Dr. Goel to introduce himself and share his background with us.
Well, thank you, Aditi. I appreciate you working on this topic with me. It's so easy to work with you. You have such a winning smile and such a warm personality. So I'm very happy to be chatting with you on this topic of presidential system for India. Would that be better than the present parliamentary system in India? In terms of my background, I grew up in a rural part of Punjab, Sangrur district, Patiala. These are the names that may be familiar to some of the viewers here. Um, but I came to the United States many moons ago to do my graduate work. And I have attended the University of Oregon for a couple of years, but then I did my doctoral work at State University of New York at Buffalo. And I've been in Florida for the last 35 plus years, having a very fulfilling teaching career. In my estimation, there's no better career path than university level teaching. So I recommend to the aspiring viewers on that account. We are recording this dialogue when there are a whole lot of protests going on account of the police high-handedness in dealing with the minorities and really with anybody. You cannot imagine a college campus in the United States without the presence of police. You cannot imagine any community, whether it's small or large, without the presence of police. Now, contrast that with the rural and small town community that I grew up in Punjab. There hardly was any police presence over there. The village rural communities are self regulated. There was very little violence in that time period. The time period I'm talking about is 1940s and 1950s. So if you want to know something about rural life in India 50, 60 years ago, you can read my life story. I've written my life story where I describe rural life as I experienced that. And you can search under my name, Dr. Madan Lal Goel, and you'll come to my web page and you can read about rural life.
That's wonderful, and we're very fortunate to have someone with Dr. Goel's level of expertise in political science with us for this important topic. For the benefit of our audience, would you tell us a little bit about different types of political systems around the world today, and some of the different systems that we see before we get into discussing India more specifically?
Yes, Aditi, very briefly, there have been many different types of political systems around the globe from old times. I'll mention four or five important ones which have lasted the longest period of time. The first one I would mention is the monarchy or the kingship. Most countries, including in India, for the larger part of their history, were governed by a Raja or a Maharaja. And kingship or the monarchy has by and large disappeared now, with the exception of few countries like in the Middle East, for example, Saudi Arabia or Oman or Kuwait. So monarchy, even though kingship, even though lasted the longest period of time, is in disrepute at the present time. Another form of government, which also lasted very long time, is the dictatorship, also called authoritarianism. Example of that would be like Muhammad Gaddafi in Libya or Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And there have been many dictatorships around the globe. And the third type of kind of a regime, which was prominent in the 20th century, we called totalitarian dictatorship. And an example of that would be like the Soviet regime under Stalin, and to some extent, or rather to a large extent, presently in China as well. We call that a totalitarian dictatorship because it was a total control by the political establishment, political authority, not only on the political decision making, but also control of the economy, control of the culture, and even how children were being raised. And of course, totalitarian regimes in the Soviet Union and in Nazi Germany as well have disappeared, but to some extent it does continue in China. Now, the most popular form of government, interestingly, is the democracy. There are about 195 countries in the world, more or less, and about half, about 100 countries are classified as either fully democratic or at least as partly democratic. And that is very, very interesting that as many countries around the world are classified, at least to some extent, as being democratic. Of course, there are many different forms of democracy, presidential versus parliamentary.
So let's start getting into it with India. So could you describe for us India's current parliamentary system, its origins from colonial times, its characteristics, and let's start with that, and perhaps some of the disadvantages that you see from the parliamentary system.
Yeah, India is a parliamentary system of government as contrasted with a presidential system of government, and I'll come to that in a minute. A parliamentary system is modeled after the British practice. By the way, parliamentary system is quite popular around the globe. All of the former British colonies like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, India, Nigeria, all of these countries and more than that have adopted a parliamentary system of government. I think the viewers are most likely familiar with the parliamentary system of government, meaning that elections are held for the parliament, and the majority party, if there is a single majority party, then the leader of that party will be elected as the prime minister, and the prime minister will select a executive or a cabinet which also will be members of the parliament. Now, the parliamentary system of government usually is described as one with fusion of powers. In a parliamentary system of government, you fuse the legislative powers with the executive powers. The executive is a branch of the parliament. So the prime minister and the members of the cabinet have seats within the parliament. And that is an important feature. It has both pluses and minuses of that feature, to which I will come in a minute. Now, just to contrast that with a presidential system, in a presidential system like in the United States, the executive, which is the president and his cabinet, is separate from the legislative body. In the case of the United States, the legislative body is called the Congress, which is the bicameral, the House of Representatives and the Senate. So the president and the cabinet, they do not sit in the legislative body, they're separated. So the American system of government, which is a typical presidential system, is usually characterized as one with separation of powers. The executive is separated from the legislative body. The legislators are not members of the presidential cabinet. No member of the Congress, whether a senator or member of the House of Representatives, can be a member of the executive. And reversely also, the president does not sit in the parliament or in the Congress. And none of the members of the cabinet, presidential cabinet, have seats in the Congress in America. So there are pluses and minuses of both of these systems.
I was going to ask, particularly as you were describing the parliamentary system, is there history, let's say British history, with the monarchy and the tension between the monarchy and the lords that created this parliamentary system, or in the development of the presidential system that you think led to these different systems?
Well, the British political system is regarded as evolutionary. At one time in the 17th century, Elizabeth I and Henry VIII, they were very powerful monarchs, as we know. But gradually, over next 200-300 year period, the power devolved to the Parliament and to the House of Commons there. England is exceptional in the sense that there has been no revolution. The monarchy, kings and the queens, have not been overthrown like it happened in some other country, like, for example, in France, where the Louis XVI was beheaded at the time of the French Revolution, 1789. In England, it did not happen. But the power to the devolution of the power to the House of Commons has been a gradual process lasting more than a couple of hundred years. In many other countries, like in India, Japan, and take any other parliamentary system like in Italy or in Germany, these systems were created after World War II. And largely that is because of the prestige of the British system. After all, Britain controlled a huge empire. The sun, it is claimed that the sun never set on the British Empire. They were the strongest power in the world for, I don't know, 75 years or maybe 100 years. So strong countries their practices tend to be duplicated. So many countries adopted the British parliamentary system. Now, American Revolution happened a long time ago, back in 1776, when there was no powerful parliament. That was George III. He was the ruling monarch, and so it was a rebellion against monarchy. So Americans did not adopt the British parliamentary system. They went a different way.
So now coming to India, what would you say are some of the potential disadvantages or drawbacks in having the current parliamentary system model in India?
Well, Aditi, parliamentary system worked very well in Britain. Okay, the success of the British model was copied in many different countries. Now, parliamentary system works well in a small, unified country, not a very large country, very diverse country, like the case of India. In the case of India, the parliamentary system has given rise to multitude of political parties. In any given election, you will have, you can really take any number, you'll have 15 to 25, sometimes even 25 different political parties competing and actually gaining at least a few seats in the Lok Sabha. And the result of that is that no single party, with the exception of a couple of times, like at the present BJP government, but most of the time, no single party has a majority. So most of the government, like in 2004 and before that, 2009, when Manmohan Singh was the prime minister, and before that, in the 1990s, most of the governments were coalition governments. And the coalition governments, by definition, tend to be unstable. Coalitions can break up. Also, they tend to be weaker government because you got to accommodate all the coalition partners. So in the case of India, India's fractured electorate, you will see that 8,251 candidates for 543 seats. So that means there are 15 candidates that are competing in a typical parliamentary constituency. So the result of that is that one needs merely 25 to 30% of the vote to win. And the implication of that also is that an entrenched minority with block voting exercises much influence. I think there has been a lot of discussion in India about block voting and how important it is. There's a Muslim block vote, there's a Sikh block vote, there's a Dalit block vote, there's a Maharashtrian block vote, and so forth. It tends to divide the electorate into the so-called voting blocks. So it leads to a weaker government, leads to an unstable government. Now I have a second slide here, if you can look at that, which indicates the different political parties that exist in India. Now, again, you will see, I don't know, there are 19 or 20 different parties, and this is not the total list of the political party.
Dr. Goel, I think you make a very compelling case that for stability, for having more effective governance, a streamlined two-party type of system would be better. Given how large India is, its diversity, linguistic, cultural, regional, do you have any worries that going to a two-party system could come at the sacrifice of some of that representation of that diversity?
Yes, Aditi, you make a very good point. To some extent, a two-party system indeed would sacrifice some of the variation that we see in the culture and the social landscape of India. But at the same time, in a presidential election campaign, um, where the election will be likely among two or three leading candidates, these different groups will have to come together. Like it happened in the present 2019 and to some extent the 2014 election, Narendra Modi was projected as a national leader. So a number of these different groups and political parties came together. Of necessity, they will have to come together. Now, this diversity that you're speaking about, which is important and praiseworthy, could still be represented in the Lok Sabha, because Lok Sabha has 543 members, and different ethnicities and different states would have appropriate representation over there. But at least in terms of the executive, which will be the president and the cabinet, that will not be at the mercy of shifting coalitions in the Lok Sabha in the case of India. So it will be, in my estimation, it will be best of both worlds. You will have unified executive elected for a 5-year term or whatever the constitution says. In some countries, the executive is elected for a 7-year term. In case of India, it could be 5 years or 7 years. So the government will not fall. A drawback of the parliamentary system, if I can draw the example of a couple of other countries which demonstrate the weakness of a parliamentary system even more so. Recently in the country of Israel, they had 3 different elections in Israel in 2019 and 2020. Now, why did that happen? Because in Israel, even though they're a small country, it has a very diverse population. Some people have come from Russia, others from Germany, others even from India. There's Jews from India have gone to Israel. So it's a very diverse population, and they have several different political parties. And they had to have 3 different elections because none of the political parties or the coalition political parties could command majority. So they held one election, nobody could form a government. They had another election, and they have had to repeat 3 different elections in 1 year. In a smaller country with a two-party system, with a where there are not many different competing blocks, such has been the case in Britain in its history for the last couple of hundred years. But even in Britain, that two-party system that we have seen in its history is weakening to some extent, because there is the Scottish National Party, there's the Welsh National Party, there's the Green political party. So Britain may not be an example of a stable political system as it has been in its history. And because of the prestige and the power of the British system, now this point that I'm making is even more manifested in India at the state level. The state level governments fall apart more commonly, more regularly, more often. And also, there are many elections in India. They say there's an election almost every year. There's some kind of an election in India every year, because the political system has crumbled in one state or the other. The government has been thrown out of office through a vote of no confidence. There's a new election.
One of the important takeaways from this discussion for me is how much these political systems are a reflection of unique socio-political dynamics of different countries. So you were talking about the British origins of the parliamentary system, and how after World War I, there was this desire to replicate that model in different countries. And then the presidential system was born out of this American resistance to the monarchy. So along those lines, we've been talking a lot about the presidential model, the parliamentary model, looking at India as a unique civilization and Indian history and Indic traditions. Do you think it's more aligned from that indigenous perspective with one of these models, or would it perhaps have an alternative model that could one day be an alternative to the parliamentary and presidential systems based on a dharmic governance, let's say?
In case of India, most of its history, India has been governed by Rajas and Maharajas. And I'm glad to say that under that monarchical system, which existed in India for the longest period of time, there was this separation of power, which is a very admired concept presently. In America, they say, they have separation of powers. In Britain, there's a separation of powers. Judiciary is independent, executive is independent. In the case of India, yes, there was a separation of power, but it was a different kind. The Rajas, Maharajas were usually from the Kshatriya caste, and the advisors were Brahmins, and the money power of the Vash, they were the ones who contributed the resources for the regime, and the soldiers were often recruited from the Shudras, the fourth group. So there was, in a way, there was a division of power in that sense in India as well. And also there was a great commitment to dharma. They were guided, they were governed by the dharmic principles. They could not do anything which was against the religious principles or the dharma. That was very, very important. If we read the Ramayana, for example, there's a case in Ramayana, one minister, Jabali, was advising Rama. He says, why don't you simply take over? Dasharatha is an old man and he's feeble and all that, simply take over. And Rama refuted that argument. So no, we can't do that. That's not a tradition. We have to follow what the dharmic principles are. If I do something, like them, then other people will follow my example. So that's it's a good indication how committed our kings and monarchs were to the dharmic principles. Um, so we cannot, in other words, the question that you raise, can we borrow something from the Indian history, Indian tradition? Well, unfortunately, we cannot. Um, but that doesn't mean that we have to borrow wholesale or whole scale from the Western model, which may be suitable, may not be suitable. Like I indicated to begin with in this conversation, that about half the governments in the world today are democratic, some form of democracy, either presidential or parliamentary democracy. There has to be some kind of a democracy, because that's what is the legitimate system of government. And the question is, what kind of a democracy? Now, I could mention another point, Aditi. Mahatma Gandhi, the revered leader of the independence struggle, he did not favor a British kind of a parliamentary system for India. Now, he died in, what was it, 1948, just about a year after independence. So he didn't write any systematic treatise on that. But his idea was that villages and the smaller communities should have panchayats, and then the panchayats would elect members to the state legislative assemblies, and then the state legislative assemblies would in turn elect members to the national parliament. So that's the kind of an idea that he had. It will be a democratic system, but more tiered rather than 500 million people trudging to the polling booths, and people being pressed to vote a particular way and bribed. There are a lot of I have watched some of the elections in India. There's a lot of liquor that is distributed, cheap liquor. It costs, I don't know, 50 rupees or 100 rupees a bottle. Locals too. So that's what I saw. So it leads to corruption that way. To come back to your point, could we draw something of our history from our background? Unhappily, we can't go back to that period. We have moved on. The world has moved on. It has to be some kind of a democratic system, because that's what's legitimate now in India as well as many other countries.
That's very interesting. You'd spoken about different countries abandoning the parliamentary system in favor of the presidential system. Based on those examples, are there any lessons or learnings for India if it were to pursue a presidential system, and what would you see as a possible road forward to reaching that end?
Well, it's not going to be an easy change. First of all, a presidential system of government for India, I don't think it's being discussed about. You cannot impose it in India. There has to be a lot of discussion about it. Now, maybe there has been some discussion on it, but I'm not privy to a whole lot of it. So the points that I'm making in some ways are novel. I hope it will lead to some kind of a little more widening discussion on this topic. Should we continue with a parliamentary system of government which has problems, at the state level, more so than at the national level? And I can discuss more about some of the strengths of the presidential system. Another point I like to make: the cabinet under the presidential system is recruited from professionals, like the Secretary of the Treasury, for example, will have somebody who understands the financial system, who has a background in that area. A Secretary of Foreign Affairs, or Secretary of State, as he or she is called in the United States. We have had eminent professors who have been recruited to fill that role, like Henry Kissinger and Brzezinski. He was an advisor to Carter. And other examples can be cited. So under a presidential system, the cabinet can be recruited from experts in the field, unlike in a parliamentary system where they're politicians, I mean, there's nothing wrong. Politicians have a role to play, but they are not subject matter specialists. So that I think would be another positive point of a presidential system of government for any country, including for India. Uh, another couple of points, Aditi, I want to make, which are kind of typical of India, um, which don't define or describe many other countries, and your viewers would be interested in that. And one of those points is the voting turnout in India is really different than the voting turnout patterns in many other countries around the globe. Okay, what I'm talking about is that in India, the educated people vote in significantly lower percentages than the poor and the uneducated. This is a slide about the United States, which indicates higher the education, higher the vote. You can see that with the increase in education, voting percentage increases from 38% all the way to 84% among the people who have graduate education. There's this pattern where the voting rate increases with increase in education, which you see demonstrated here in the slide in the United States, is typical of many countries. It's not only applicable to the United States, but also many countries, both Western countries as well as Asian countries. So higher the education, higher the income, higher the voting rate. In India, it's the other way around. Higher the education, lower the vote. Do you see that? Now, the voting turnout does increase from illiterate to primary or middle, as you see, from 57 to 83%. But the lowest voting rate is among the college graduates and the postgraduates. Higher the education, lower the voting rate. And that is really unfortunate because the leaders who get elected, they represent the interests of the populace. And if the educated people and the affluent people and the well-off people don't participate, then their interests, their policy preferences are certainly not reflected in what the parliament or the leaders do.
Do you have any theories or explanations of why this may be the case in India? Because in general, we would expect what you see in the US.
Yeah. I have a couple of hunches about that. One is simply a matter of the timing that some of these elections are held. And, recall that the last couple of elections, or maybe even last 4 or 5 elections, are held in late April and May, which is a very hard period in the Indian climate. And elections are not held in India, unlike in the United States, on a definite period. It's a choice that the government makes. I think the voting rate among the more affluent and the more educated would increase if the elections are held in month of February and March. I don't know if the leaders know that the voting rate among the better educated and more affluent is much lower than among the poorer and the less well educated. And that one reason might be extreme hot weather when the elections are being held in month of May, which happen, quite frequently. If they were aware of that, I'm sure they should be. I don't know. I wrote a book about this some 20 years ago, and I saw that pattern I've done a study of the Indian elections. I published that book back in 1975 or 76. So, it's more than 20 years. And that's what I found way back then, that the upper class and the more educated and the more affluent were voting in lower numbers. And at that time, I attributed that to greater level of alienation among the better educated. This slide indicates the voting rate among different religious communities in India. Hindus have the lowest voting rate. So it's not only that the better educated and the more affluent vote in lower numbers, but the Hindu voting rate, as found in some studies, is the lowest. You can see from the demeanor, the faces, and the head coverings of these women that they belong to average or lower socioeconomic status in India. That's a guess on my part, but I don't think I'm too far off in making that guess, that these are average female voters in India rather than better educated, rather than college educated or affluent voters. Now, this is another slide. You can see, and the same point, that these women represent the average, not the better educated, not the affluent, not the college postgraduate female voter in India. The voters in this line are members of the Sikh community, as you can tell from the turban that they're wearing and the beards that they're supporting. Of course, Punjabi Hindus also wear turbans. My father used to wear a turban on ceremonial occasions. And when I got married, I wore a turban because that was the traditional method. So, but Sikhs certainly wear a turban. And Sikhs have the highest voting rate in India, as I indicated before, at 81%. And Hindus have the lowest voting rate at about 60%, as I indicated before.
Dr. Well, I also wanted to ask you, with the wide diaspora of Indians abroad and NRIs, what do you think the role is of the NRI community in the Indian political system?
Well, I think NRIs have a very important role to play because, we are at a distance. We can observe what's going on in India. And even though NRIs, when they begin to discuss the internal affairs within India, sometimes, commentators on Indian TV or newspaper, they criticize that these guys have left India, they're settled overseas, they talk about India. What do they know? How do they care? If they're strong opinion, they need to be in the game. Mahatma Gandhi is, taken to be a fighter for in independence. Would our viewers believe that Mahatma Gandhi, I think, spent some 42 years overseas? Not only he was educated in England, but then after he came back to India, he got a job working in the British imperial system in South Africa. And he was there for, I think, from 1892 to nearly to 1915. So he spent, I don't know, 15, 16, 17 years in South Africa. And so he was an NRI. Veer Savarkar was an NRI. He was in England. Jawaharlal Nehru was a student at Harrow. Madam Kama, whose name appears, was an NRI. And so, the list of the NRIs is a long one. And sometimes also, I like to say that the distance gives you the proper perspective. The best book written on American democracy is not by an American, but is by Alex de Tocqueville, who was a Frenchman. He came to America and he stayed here and studied the American political system and society. And he wrote this 2-volume book called Democracy in America. And Aditi, would you believe that book is still being used in the college courses in America? I myself have used that book, a part of that book in the courses that I taught. And so, you can call him, he was an NRA, non-resident American.
This has been a very informative and insightful discussion. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Are there any final thoughts you would like to share with us before we conclude?
Well, I have a slide here. The title of the slide is India's Defective Political System. The present weak and divided system must be toppled, thrown away, gotten rid of, sooner the better. Now, this is a very, very strong statement on my part, and a lot more needs to be said on that. Now, in order to bring about this change, the Indian Constitution is modeled after the British parliamentary system. It is ill-suited for a large and diverse country like India. It leads to weak and divided government. The election results produce instability. They are held on a determined date and the government does not fall, as I have been indicating or explaining. This does not apply to the governments don't fall there. The presidents can be impeached, which is a very difficult process, as the winning party never receives a majority of the vote in India. Okay, in the last 2004 election, BJP won 282 out of 543 seats, but only 31% of the popular vote. In every election, more people vote against the winning party or the ruling party than they vote for it. So in terms of the popular vote, all governments in India are minority governments. And then the last point I make that the parliamentary multi-party system in India produces some of the worst political leaders. And I've given some of the names. I hope I don't insult anybody by listing some of these names, but you can select your own. The viewers can put their own names there. But it's a system, the parliamentary system does not lend to political stability or better system of government for a large, diverse, multi-party system like in India. Now, how do you change it? Aditi, you might ask, how do you go about changing that? Well, such large-scale changes cannot come about easily. This topic needs to be discussed at many different avenues and by many different people who are familiar with this issue. Look at the plus and the minuses. So you need to create a clientele. Unfortunately, sometimes in India, they make decisions, the parliament, without preparing the ground for it. That recently, like we have seen, like, I don't know, like CAA. There was so much opposition to CAA because people simply don't understand. They didn't understand, inaccurate interpretation. Then they needed to prepare the ground before they pass it. They need to explain what CAA is before they pass that legislation. And also, I would like to say that amending the Constitution is much easier than is the case in the United States. So changing the system will require a constitutional amendment. In the United States, in long 230 or 240-year history, there have been only 26 or 27 constitutional amendments, and you would know that better, Aditi, being an attorney. Whereas in India, in a short history of 70 years, from 1951, when the constitution was adopted, to now, there have been over 100 amendments. And then the number is something like 106 or 107. So amending the constitution is much easier in India than is the case in some other countries. So, but the ground needs to be prepared. There needs to be a lot of discussion, and I hope I have started the ball rolling. I hope the viewers will pick this topic up for discussion. I've just made some points, and a lot more could be said in favor, and I'm sure as well as against what I'm talking about.
Thank you so much, Dr. Goel. It was such a thought-provoking presentation that you give, and I think it'll be a catalyst for a conversation that we need to be having at a much deeper level. And it was wonderful having this conversation with you. Namaste and thank you.
Well, thank you, Aditi. I appreciate you dialoguing with me. You're such a wonderful and committed person. And it's just a pleasure on my part for me to be speaking with you on this very important topic. I hope it will lead to more discussion.
Thank you for watching. You can subscribe here and also hit the bell icon to make sure you get notified. To donate, please click this button.